They pointed at the beeping machine beside me, the heart monitor keeping track of every fragile beat, and one of them laughed. "She's already counting down." The others chuckled, as if my life were a punchline. I smiled faintly, not because it was funny, but because in that exact moment, I knew their laughter had just cost them everything. "Hello, my name is Judith, and before I begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I'd love to know, because this story is for anyone who's ever felt invisible in their own family. Now, let me tell you how a cruel joke in a hospital room turned into my greatest act of justice. I had been admitted a week earlier after a sudden dizzy spell left me collapsed in my kitchen. The doctors ran tests, told me my heart wasn't as strong as it used to be, and kept me under observation. Wires, monitors, constant beeping. The hospital became my world for those long days. I expected fear, maybe even loneliness. But I didn't expect cruelty. My children visited in shifts, but not out of love. They carried an energy, an impatience, as though they weren't visiting their mother, but attending some grim countdown event. Instead of warmth, they spoke in whispers, glances exchanged over my head. I could feel their conversations circling around my absence more than my presence. About the house, the accounts, the things I owned. That day, when one of them joked about my heart monitor, pointing at the flickering line as if it were a timer, something inside me shifted. They thought I was weak. They thought I was already gone. But I wasn't. I closed my eyes, let their laughter fade into the sterile air, and smiled. Not at them, but at the plan forming in my mind. If they wanted to mock my life, they'd soon discover how little of it belonged to them. As I lay there, I thought back over my years of sacrifice. My late husband, Daniel, and I had built our lives brick by brick. We hadn't been wealthy, not at first. He was a mechanic, I was a school secretary. But together, we scraped, saved, and invested wisely. We bought our modest home outright. We tucked away money in retirement accounts, and Daniel left me a small life insurance policy when he passed. I guarded it all, not for myself, but for the children. I thought one day, when they needed help, I'd be their safety net. But sitting in that hospital bed, with wires taped to my chest and my own flesh and blood laughing at the sound of my heartbeat, I realized something. I wasn't a safety net to them. I was a vault waiting to be unlocked. The realization hurt more than any chest pain. That night, after the nurses dimmed the lights, I reached for the little notepad I kept by my bedside. My hands trembled as I wrote down names, people I could still trust. There weren't many. Old friends had drifted. Neighbors came and went. But one name stood out, steady as a rock in my memory. Mr. Carter, my husband's old friend and the lawyer who had guided us through our first home purchase decades ago. Daniel always said, "Carter is a man of honor. If you ever need protection, he'll know what to do." I underlined his name twice. The next morning, my daughter came in with coffee she didn't intend to share. She scrolled on her phone the entire time, barely glancing at me. At one point, she muttered, "Mum, you should really think about writing down where everything is. You know, in case—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I nodded, hiding the chill that spread through me. She wanted an inventory, not reassurance. She wanted a map to my life before I was even cold. And so I smiled again. The same smile I'd worn when they mocked my heart monitor. But this time, my smile was armor. Because inside, I had made a promise. Before I ever left this earth, they would learn what it meant to underestimate me. That evening, when visiting hours ended and the room fell quiet, I whispered aloud, just for myself, "They think I'm counting down, but I'm counting them out." And with that, my story truly began. The hospital stay gave me far too much time to think. Lying there, with machines hissing and nurses padding in and out, I wandered back through the corridors of my own past. I remembered my first years as a mother, when money was tight but love was abundant. Daniel and I used to laugh about how we could stretch $1 until it begged for mercy. I packed lunches in reused bags, stitched hand-me-downs into something wearable, and worked double hours at the school just so the kids could have birthday parties that looked a little like the ones their classmates enjoyed. I didn't resent it. Not once. Every sacrifice was worth the way their eyes lit up when they opened a gift or tasted their favorite cake. I thought then, this is love, this is family. But sitting in that hospital bed, watching them scroll on phones and whisper over my head, I realized how far from that picture we'd come. I thought about the first real investment Daniel and I made, our house. It wasn't grand, but it was ours. I can still picture the day we signed the papers, Daniel shaking Carter's hand, saying, "This will be theirs one day." He meant the children. Over the years, we added little by little. A savings account here, a small land plot outside the city, a modest portfolio Daniel insisted on learning to manage. After he died, I took it all seriously, making sure nothing was wasted. The assets weren't millions, but they were security. Enough to protect me, enough to someday pass on. But now I saw the truth. They weren't waiting to honor what their father and I had built. They were waiting to cash it in like gamblers at a casino. One afternoon, a nurse came in and adjusted my IV. As she fussed over the beeping machine, she smiled at me. "You have such a strong spirit," she said. I almost laughed at the irony. My family thought I was fragile, a dying relic. But here was this stranger, seeing something they never could, my strength. When the nurse left, I whispered to myself, if they think I'll hand over my life's work while they mock me, they're mistaken. The more I thought, the clearer it became. My children weren't cruel strangers. They were my children. I had raised them. I had fed them. I had wiped their tears and clapped at their school plays. But somewhere along the way, their love had thinned, replaced by calculation. It hurt more deeply than words can explain. Because betrayal from an enemy is expected. Betrayal from your own blood. It cuts into the bone. Still, I wouldn't let that pain destroy me. Instead, I decided to turn it into resolve. I began to picture scenarios in my head. I imagined them after my funeral, sitting around a polished oak table, waiting for the lawyer to read the will. I could almost hear their smug voices. The house is mine. No, Mom promised it to me. What about the accounts? She said. I smiled to myself. Because what they didn't know was that the script they were rehearsing in their minds was about to be torn up and rewritten entirely by me. I remembered something Daniel had once said after a bitter argument with his brother about inheritance. Money changes people, Judith. Blood doesn't matter when dollar signs are in their eyes. At the time, I brushed it off. I thought love was stronger than greed. Now, years later, in a hospital bed with tubes in my arm, I saw his words were prophecy. So, I began plotting my own prophecy. I made a mental inventory. The house, the land, the savings, the retirement accounts, jewelry that had belonged to my mother, even small things that held sentimental weight. All of it could be shifted, signed, sealed in a way that would make their greedy fingers slip through air when they tried to grab. I felt a strange calm as I thought through it all. Not revenge, justice. A quiet rebalancing of the scales. The next day, my eldest son leaned over me and whispered, "Mum, you know we'll take care of everything once you're gone, right?" His tone wasn't comforting. It was possessive, assuring me that my life's work was already theirs. I looked at him, let the corner of my mouth twitch into that same secret smile I'd worn before, and whispered back, "Oh, I know." If only he knew what I really meant. That night, staring at the ceiling tiles, I felt something ignite inside me. I wasn't just recovering from an illness, I was awakening. My heart might have been monitored, but my mind was racing, sharper than it had been in years. And somewhere deep inside, I felt Daniel with me, steadying my resolve. Do it, Judith. Protect what we built. Protect yourself. So I decided. As soon as I was discharged, I would call Carter. I would make the changes, and my children would never see it coming. The day they wheeled me out of the hospital, I felt a quiet strength return. My body was weaker, yes. Slower steps, a little dizziness still lingering. But my spirit carried me like a hidden engine. I didn't tell my children when I'd be discharged. Let them think I needed them. Let them believe I was fragile. I called a cab, gave the driver my address, and the moment I settled into the back seat, I slipped my phone out and dialed the number I hadn't used in years. Mr. Carter. His voice came through warm and steady, as if no time had passed. Judith? My goodness. It's been a while, I swallowed hard, lowering my voice. Carter, I need your help. And I need it kept quiet. There was a pause. Then that old lawyer's calm returned. Say no more. When can you come in? The very next morning, I sat in his office. The smell of leather-bound books, old wood polish, and faint coffee comforted me more than any hospital machine had. Carter looked older, grey hair thinner now, but his eyes hadn't changed. They were sharp, the eyes of a man who had seen too many families torn apart by greed. I told him everything. The hospital stay, the laughter, the way my children hovered not out of care but calculation. I didn't cry. I'd shed enough tears in silence. But my voice trembled when I said, Carter, they're counting the days until I die. I want them to count empty-handed. He leaned forward, folding his hands. Then we must move quickly. We started with the house. Carter pulled out files, tapped the desk. Right now, it's in all your children's expectations, if not in writing. We changed that. We drafted papers to move the deed solely under my control. No shared claims, no promises. Then we talked about the land plot outside town. Easily transferred into trust, Carter said, adjusting his glasses. Irrevocable. They won't touch it. Next came the savings accounts. Carter helped me set up a living trust with me as the trustee. My children? Excluded. If anything happened, the funds would bypass them entirely. Finally, we went through the smaller details. Jewelry, heirlooms, a box of coins Daniel had collected over the years. Every item has value, Judith, Carter reminded me. Don't underestimate their hunger. By the end of the day, a fortress had been built. Not of bricks, but of documents, signatures, and sealed envelopes. As I signed the last page, my hand shook slightly. Carter reached over, steadying it. You're doing the right thing, he said softly. I nodded, exhaling. This isn't revenge, Carter. It's protection. Protection from the people who should have been protecting me. Walking out of that office, I felt lighter than I had in years. My children thought they had time on their side. But what they didn't realize was that time belonged to me. Each hour I lived was another hour I rewrote the script of their future. That evening, I returned home to a quiet house. I sat in Daniel's old chair, the leather worn from his years of use, and stared at the pictures on the mantel. Weddings, birthdays, Christmas mornings. Smiling faces frozen in time before greed had sharpened them. I wondered, when did love fade into entitlement? When did my children stop seeing me as a mother and start seeing me as a bank? The questions burned, but I pushed them aside. Reflection wouldn't save me. Action already had. The very next day, my youngest son stopped by unannounced. He carried grocery bags, set them down on the counter and said, I thought you might need help, Mum. But his eyes darted around the kitchen, pausing at the mail stack, the drawers, the cabinet where I kept important documents. He wasn't there to help. He was scouting. I smiled, offering him tea. He chatted, asked subtle questions. So, have you ever thought about what you'd want us to do with the house? Do you have a will already drawn up? As if the words were casual. But his tone betrayed him. Inside, I almost laughed. He was fishing in an empty pond. When he left, I locked the door, leaned against it, and whispered, "They don't know. They'll never know until it's too late." That night, I tucked away the copies of my trust documents in a fireproof safe Daniel had once bought. On top, I placed an old photograph of us, young and smiling, the day we bought the house. A reminder. This was built with love, and I would guard it with the same. The plan was in motion now. The assets were secure. My children still laughed in their arrogance, still circled like vultures around what they thought was their inheritance. But the trap had been set, and the day they came to claim their imagined fortune, they would learn just how sharp a mother's quiet justice could be. A week after I secured everything with Carter, my children gathered at the house for dinner. It wasn't my idea. My daughter, Lorraine, had called earlier that day with a bright, brittle voice. "Mum, let's all come over tonight." You shouldn't be alone so much. I almost laughed at the sudden concern. Not once during my hospital stay had they lingered by my side without a clock ticking in their heads. But now, they wanted to sit at my table. I said yes. Not because I wanted company, but because I wanted to watch them in their natural element, hungry, circling, unaware that the feast had already been cleared away. The table was set the way Daniel always loved it: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. I kept my hands busy, even though my heart felt heavy. They arrived with smiles, kisses on cheeks, little gestures of affection that felt practiced, rehearsed. At first, the conversation was light: work stories, a joke about traffic, talk of Lorraine's youngest getting into college. But soon, as I knew it would, the tone shifted. "Mum," my eldest son, Richard, said between bites, "you know, if anything happens, we'll keep the house in the family." "Don't worry about that," Lorraine chimed in, sipping her wine. "Yes, of course. It'll stay in our name. Maybe I'll move in here. This kitchen has always been my favorite." Her husband chuckled. "Or sell it. Prices are good these days. You'd be surprised what it could fetch." I felt my fork pause mid-air. There it was. The conversation they thought they were being casual about, but their voices carried a greed that thickened the air. They weren't talking about memories. They weren't talking about my life lived in these walls. They were already counting the bricks, the dollars, the inheritance. And the worst part, they spoke as though I wasn't there. I sat at the head of the table, quiet, invisible in my own home, while my children divided my belongings like traders at a market stall. Inside, I burned. But outside, I smiled. Always that same smile. It wasn't joy, it was armor, and it was sharper than any words I could have spoken. At one point, Lorraine turned to me, her voice softening. "Mum, you know we only want the best for you. But it would make things easier if you wrote things down. Like, who gets what. That way, no fights later." I met her eyes, steady. "You're right," I said. "I wouldn't want anyone to fight." She relaxed, thinking she'd nudged me towards surrender. If only she knew that the papers were already signed, sealed, and locked away. Documents that cut her completely out. After dessert, my youngest, Michael, leaned back in his chair and sighed. "You've done well, Mum. We'll be okay when the time comes, when the time comes." As if I were nothing but an hourglass, my sand already halfway gone. I wanted to scream, to slam my hand on the table and shout, "I'm not dead yet. I'm your mother, not your meal ticket." But I didn't, because silence was my weapon now, and I was wielding it with precision. After they left, The house grew quiet again. I walked through each room slowly, my hand trailing along the walls. The photographs stared back at me. Daniel holding our first baby, Christmas mornings, birthdays with icing-smeared smiles. The images were full of love, but the present was barren of it. I stood in the living room, whispering into the empty air. They think they're ready for my death. They don't know they've already lost everything. The following week, their visits became more frequent. At first, I wondered if guilt had finally touched them. But no, it wasn't guilt. It was hunger. Richard stopped by with folders, pretending to ask about bills. Lorraine called, daily, always with questions about my accounts. Even Michael started dropping hints, saying things like, "Mum, do you really need that land outside town? No one even uses it." They thought they were subtle, but every word, every glance, every half-smile revealed the truth. They were circling, waiting, impatient vultures in nice clothes. One night, as I lay in bed, I replayed their words in my mind. For years, I had imagined my children gathering around me with love, not with calculators in their eyes. I had pictured them caring for me, not casing the house like burglars waiting for the lights to go out. The pain was sharp, but then, so was the satisfaction, because they had no idea their inheritance was already gone. I whispered into the darkness, the same vow I'd made in the hospital. They think I'm counting down, but I'm counting them out. And with that, I drifted into the deepest sleep I'd had in years, because I knew the endgame was already written. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness in my chest, not from sickness, but from clarity. The dinner had sealed it. Whatever doubt lingered in my heart about my children's intentions had vanished. They weren't waiting for my recovery. They were waiting for my end. So I called Carter again. His voice was steady, professional, though I caught the faintest hint of concern. "Judith, you sound resolved." "I am," I told him. "Let's finish this. Every last piece." That afternoon, I sat across from him once more, documents spread before us like puzzle pieces. We went line by line, the house deeded into a private trust, with me as the sole beneficiary until my death. And afterward, it would pass not to my children, but to a foundation supporting women's education. Daniel would have liked that. He'd always said knowledge was the greatest inheritance. The land plot outside town, transferred to Carter's firm to manage on behalf of a community project. I pictured my children driving out there one day, expecting to lay claim, only to find strangers building playgrounds instead. The savings and retirement accounts, split between two charities, one for heart research, another for scholarships. Poetic, I thought. My heart had been their punchline. Now it would fund discoveries that could save others. The jewelry and heirlooms? I wrote a separate note. Certain pieces to go to grandchildren who had shown me kindness. A locket for my granddaughter, who once sat with me through an entire storm when the power went out. A pocket watch to my grandson who still visited me without asking for anything. The rest, auctioned, proceeds donated, and lastly, the letters. I asked Carter to draw up a clause. Every one of my children would receive an envelope on the day of the will reading. Inside, they would find not a check, not a deed, but my words. That night, at my desk by the window, I began writing them by hand. "Susie, Richard," I wrote, "you were my firstborn. I once believed you'd always protect me, but at the hospital, when you laughed instead of holding my hand, I realized I had to protect myself instead. To Lorraine, my daughter, you always loved pretty things. I gave you dresses, dolls, a wedding you never had to pay for. But when you sat at my table and divided my home before I had even left it, you showed me that nothing I gave was enough." To Michael, "My youngest, you had the softest heart once. I held you when you cried, I defended you when you faltered. But greed has a way of hardening even the tenderest souls. You asked me about my land, as if I were already gone. So I decided, you will have no land to ask about. My hand trembled as I wrote, but I did not falter. These letters were not revenge. They were truth. The final envelope was not for them. It was for me. I wrote a letter to myself, sealed it, and placed it at the very top of the safe. It read, Judith, you are not weak. They wanted to count down your life like seconds on a clock, but you reclaimed every beat. You did not let them define your worth. This home, this fortune, this story, it ends with you, not with them. I signed it, tears sliding silently onto the page. When Carter finalized the paperwork, he leaned back in his chair and studied me. You know this will shock them. They may turn their backs completely. I met his gaze. They already did. For a long moment, we sat in silence. Then Carter gave a small, approving nod. Then let them learn. Back home, I placed the documents, the trust papers, and my letters in the fireproof safe. I turned the key with a sense of finality, hearing the click echo through the quiet room. Then I sat in Daniel's old chair, cradling the pocket watch I planned to leave for our grandson. For the first time in months, I felt peace. Because the endgame was no longer theirs to write. It was mine. Over the next few days, my children called often. Their voices were syrupy sweet, layered with false concern. Lorraine asked if I needed help sorting bills. Richard offered to take a look at my accounts. Michael suggested I move into his home for company. I played along. I thanked them. I sounded grateful. But each word I spoke was laced with the quiet satisfaction of knowing everything they coveted had already slipped through their fingers. They thought they were circling closer to the prize, but all they were circling was an empty box. I slept better than I had in years, not because I trusted my family, but because I no longer needed to. And as I drifted off each night, I heard Daniel's voice in my heart. You did it, Judith. You protected what mattered most. It was a Sunday afternoon when the storm finally broke. Lorraine had called me earlier in the week with a bright tone that barely concealed her urgency. Mom, we should all meet. Go over things. So we're prepared? Prepared. That word again. Always planning, always waiting. I agreed, though not for the reasons she hoped. Yes, I said softly. Let's meet. But Carter will be there too. There was a pause on the line, then forced cheer. Oh, good idea. Legal clarity, I could almost hear the calculation in her voice. They thought the feast was about to be served. The day arrived grey and heavy, the kind of weather that makes the air feel thick. My children came in one by one, faces arranged in masks of solemn concern. Richard carried a folder, Lorraine a notebook, Michael his restless energy. They sat around my dining table, the same one that had once been covered in birthday cakes and Christmas hams. Now it was bare, waiting. When Carter entered, briefcase in hand, I saw Richard straighten. Lorraine's eyes gleam, Michael's jaw tighten. They thought this was it, the reading of their victory. I sat at the head of the table, calm, hands folded. Carter began without flourish. His voice was measured, professional. Mrs. Judith Anderson, he said, using my full name, has requested I clarify the distribution of her assets and estate. Richard leaned forward eagerly. Lorraine's pen hovered over the page. Michael's leg bounced under the table. Carter opened the first folder. The family home, located on Hawthorne Street, has been placed in a private trust. Upon Mrs. Anderson's passing, it will not pass to any of her children, but instead will be transferred to the Hawthorne Foundation for Women's Education. The silence was immediate. Then, what? Lorraine's voice cracked. No, that can't be right. Carter didn't flinch. The paperwork is signed and filed. It is final. Richard slammed his palm on the table. This house belongs to us. Dad always said, Carter interrupted smoothly. Your father left the property solely to your mother? What she does with it is her legal right. Lorraine's pen slipped from her fingers. Michael leaned back, eyes narrowing. Carter continued. The land plot outside of town has been placed in management under a community project. The savings and retirement accounts have been secured in a living trust, designated to medical research and educational scholarships. Jewelry and heirlooms have been divided only among grandchildren named in sealed letters. Richard's face flushed red. Lorraine's lips trembled. Michael muttered under his breath, too low for me to catch. I watched them, silent, the way they had watched me in the hospital. Only this time it was their faces pale, their voices sharp, their world shifting under their feet. Lorraine finally burst out, You can't do this to us, Mom. We've been here. We've taken care of you. I raised a hand, my first gesture of the meeting. My voice was calm, steady. Taken care of me? You pointed at my heart monitor and laughed. You came into my home and divided it before I was even gone. You thought I was a clock running out. Well, time has run out, for your entitlement. The room froze. Carter slid 3 sealed envelopes across the table. From your mother. In her own words, they hesitated before opening them, but when they did, the silence grew heavier still. I watched their eyes scan the lines I had written, their lips tightening, shoulders stiffening. Richard's face turned stone. Lorraine's cheeks flushed crimson. Michael's hands shook. Tears welled in my eyes, but not from regret, from release. Finally, they were hearing me, not my laughter, not my silence, but my truth. Richard stood abruptly, pushing his chair back so hard it scraped the floor. This is betrayal. I looked up at him, my voice low. No, this is justice. Lorraine began to sob, not out of loss of me, but out of loss of what she thought was hers. Michael stormed out, muttering curses under his breath. Carter gathered his papers calmly, as though he'd seen this scene 100 times before. He turned to me. Shall I walk you to the porch, Judith? I shook my head. No, Carter. I think I'll sit here a while. Let the house remember who it truly belonged to. When the door slammed shut behind them, I sat in the silence. The dining table, the photographs, the walls, they all felt lighter, freer. My children had come expecting treasure. They left with paper cuts and the sting of truth. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel owned by anyone's expectations. My life was mine again. And I thought to myself, they pointed at my heart monitor, mocking my countdown. But today, they heard the only clock that mattered, the one that ticked down the end of their greed. The days following that meeting were eerily quiet. My phone, once buzzing with calls and messages dripping with false concern, fell silent. No more daily check-ins, no more questions about my accounts, no more offers to help with the bills. My children had gone silent, retreating into their bruised pride. At first I thought I might feel guilt. After all, what kind of mother strips her own children of inheritance? But as I moved through my home, making tea in the morning light, tending to the small garden Daniel once loved, I felt no shame, only peace. Because what I had given them over the years, the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the meals skipped so they could eat better, those things could never be measured in deeds or dollar signs. They had already received the richest inheritance I could ever give, a childhood cushioned with love. What they wanted now was not love, it was power, and that I had denied them. The first call came from Richard. His voice was hard, clipped. You humiliated us, he said. In front of a lawyer, no less. Do you know how we looked? I let the silence hang a moment before replying. Richard, you weren't humiliated by me. You were exposed by yourselves. I just held up the mirror. He cursed under his breath, then hung up. That was the last time I heard his voice. Lorraine tried a softer approach. She came by one afternoon, her face blotchy from tears. She carried a pie, the way she used to in college when she wanted something. "Mum," she said at the door, "we can fix this. Change the papers. You don't really want to cut us out, do you?" I looked at her. The same daughter I once rocked through fevers, the same girl I once drove to school dances. "Lorraine," I said gently, "you cut yourself out the day you sat at my table and carved up my house as if I were already gone." Her lips trembled. She set the pie on the porch rail and walked away. She didn't knock again. Michael was the last. He sent a text late at night, a single line. "I never thought you'd choose strangers over your own blood." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I typed back, "Blood is not an excuse for betrayal." And strangers never laughed while I was fighting for my life. I pressed send, then turned off the phone. The house became mine again in those weeks. Not a battlefield, not a vault, not a prize waiting to be divided. Just a home. I dusted Daniel's bookshelves, polished his tools, watered the plants he once tended on the porch. The walls, stripped of their echoes of arguments, seemed to sigh with relief. One afternoon, I sat by the window and watched children ride bikes down the street. Their laughter was light, unburdened. I thought of the foundation that would one day own this house, the scholarships that would be funded by my accounts, the research my money would support. I imagined lives touched by my choice, lives that would never know my name, but would feel my hand steadying them in their own struggles. That was legacy, not greed, not entitlement. Legacy. Sometimes at night, I replayed the scene at the dining table, the shock in their faces, the silence after Carter's words, the way they opened those letters with shaking hands. The pain still lingered, yes, but it was layered now with something stronger, dignity, because for once I had chosen myself. Weeks later, I returned to the hospital for a checkup. The same nurse who had once told me I had a strong spirit greeted me. She adjusted my blood pressure cuff, glanced at the monitor, and smiled. "Your heart's steady," she said. "You're doing well." I smiled back, feeling tears prick my eyes. My heart is steady, I thought, because it no longer beats under the weight of betrayal. When I left the hospital that day, I paused by the automatic doors, breathing in the fresh air. People bustled, passed, families, patients, doctors. But for me, the world had slowed. I wasn't counting down anymore. I was living. And somewhere, I knew my children were still fuming, still plotting, still stewing in their bitterness. But their anger no longer had claws in me. They could rage. They could curse my name. They could call me cruel. But none of it mattered, because I had written the ending to my own story. That night, sitting by Daniel's chair with a cup of tea, I whispered into the stillness. They thought they owned my countdown, but I set the clock myself, and it struck at the very moment they least expected it. The house was quiet, but in that silence, I felt Daniel beside me, not as a memory, but as strength. And with that, I knew the story wasn't about loss. It was about freedom. It was nearly a month later when I heard the knock. I opened the door to find Michael, my youngest, standing on the porch. His face was drawn, eyes tired, but not with remorse, with desperation. "Mum," he began, voice low, "I'm sorry. We handled things badly, but maybe you could reconsider? Change the papers, just for us?" There it was. Not an apology for the cruelty, not a plea for forgiveness. A bargain. I studied him for a long moment. The boy I once carried on my hip was gone. In his place stood a man blinded by greed. "Michael," I said quietly, "I didn't take anything from you. I simply gave away what was mine. What you lost was never yours to begin with." His mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, he had no words. He turned, shoulders heavy, and walked away down the steps. I closed the door gently behind him and leaned against it. There was no joy in the moment, but there was peace. I walked back to Daniel's chair, sat down, and glanced at the heart monitor I kept at home for my own reassurance. The line pulsed steady, strong. They said I was counting down, I whispered to the empty room. But the only countdown that mattered was to this moment, when I chose myself. Outside, the world moved on. Inside, I felt free.